The deafening roar of the crowd assaults the ears. The blinding light and dust of the arena obscure the eyes. His throat is dry with cold fear. Tiro, a novice, sees his opponent, a seasoned killing machine whose scars tell dozens of stories of survival. The tension reaches its peak. Death seems inevitable. But in the stands, a man in an expensive toga is not watching with anxiety, but with pure panic. This is the lanista, the owner of the gladiatorial school, and he is not afraid that his fighter will die. He is terrified that his costly asset will get so much as a scratch. Before him is not a man, but walking capital worth 2,000 sestertii. This is the annual salary of 50 legionaries, which could turn to dust at any moment. On one side of the scales, a human life. On the other, money. And the second side is clearly heavier. The system of gladiatorial combat was not about death. It was about business. This strange fear of a businessman gives rise to three fundamental paradoxes that shatter our entire perception of the arena. First, why did gladiators, legally disenfranchised slaves, have access to better doctors and medical care than most free citizens of Rome? Second, how could a school owner spend a fortune equal to the annual salary of 50 legionaries to train a single fighter, only to then watch him be killed in cold blood? And the third most powerful question, what explains the shocking archaeological evidence that 9 out of 10 duels ended with both gladiators surviving when all of Roman culture, as we believe, demanded blood and death? The answers to these questions will destroy the myth you know, and we will give them to you. By the end of this investigation, you will stop seeing gladiators as characters from Hollywood movies. You will see them as elite athletes whose life and health were the primary assets of a ruthless entertainment machine. You will understand why death in the arena was economically disadvantageous. You will learn how a strange diet of barley and beans actually saved their lives by creating a bloody but safe show. Contemporaries even contemptuously called them hordieri barley eaters. And you will see how a multi-million sestertii industry actually worked, an industry that valued spectacle and drama far more than real blood. This isn't just a retelling of history. This is an economic thriller set in the arena of ancient Rome. We will trace the entire economic chain of this bloody business. In just 3 minutes, we will uncover financial reports and debt receipts from Pompeii. You will see. In black and white, why a gladiator was more like an elite Formula One driver than an expendable piece of cannon fodder. In 8 minutes, we will infiltrate the walls of the gladiator school prison. Based on bone analysis from a cemetery in Ephesus, we will learn why fighters were deliberately fattened up with barley to build a protective layer of fat, not steel muscles. And toward the end, in 20 minutes, we will reveal the most closely guarded secret of this system. The shocking truth about what actually awaited the surviving stars of the arena after their careers ended. To a lanista, a gladiator was like a chef's knife. His value was not in his ability to chop bones, but in his sharpness and skillful application. To break him meant losing an invaluable tool. How could it be that the main threat to a professional gladiator was not an opponent's steel, but a common infection in a post-fight wound? Why did a system built on violence so desperately try to save its fighters? The answer is simple. The organizers of the games, the editores, almost never bought gladiators. They rented them from the lanistae. The reality was even more cynical. The rental contract included a clause for a gigantic fine. In the event of a fighter's death, the editor would pay the lanista a sum 50 or even 100 times the rental price. It's like paying to rent a room for a night, but in case of damages, having to buy the entire building. Financial documents from Pompeii prove it. Every fight was a calculated business operation. Survival was not an accident, but a budgeted outcome. But if the fighters were so expensive, where did they come from? They weren't just found. They were systematically created in special factories. Why would a cynical lanista, who invested a fortune in his fighters, entrust them to politician editors? An editor's career depended on satisfying the seemingly bloodthirsty crowd. It seems like an insane risk. The basis of their trust was not words, but Roman law. A detailed legal contract was drawn up between them. It stipulated a fixed rental price per appearance, separate payments for injuries to cover treatment, and that same massive penalty for death. But it was a constant struggle between political capital and real money. The editor pushed for a spectacle. The lanista, holding a wax tablet with the contract, protected his investment. Every sestertius of penalty for scars was specified. The conclusion turns everything on its head. It was the editor, the one commissioning the games, who had the least interest in deaths, because he was the one paying the bills. But what if the crowd still demanded blood? For that, there was a special, very expensive option on the entertainment menu. If 9 out of 10 fights ended in survival, how did the image of a bloody slaughter become so firmly rooted in our culture? What is the source of this global misconception? There was a special type of duel, munera sine missione, games without mercy. This was an exclusive and extremely expensive format. An editor ordering such a show paid the full price of the Gladiators in advance and loudly advertised it on posters. It was the main attraction of the season. But even the famous police verso gesture, the turned thumb, is a historical myth. It was misinterpreted in the 19th century. The thumbs down myth was popularized by a painting from the French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme in 1872, not by ancient sources. Historians still debate its meaning. It likely meant not kill him, but finish him with a sword. A mercy blow to end the suffering. Survival was the standard. Death was a premium option. An expensive exclusive. To create fighters capable of surviving 90% of the time, an entire industry was needed. And we are heading to its heart, the elite prison called the ludus. So, we have established that the gladiatorial games were a business built on preserving, not destroying, valuable assets. Money and contracts dictated the rules, making survival the norm. But how exactly was a prisoner of war, a slave or a criminal, turned into a super athlete worth a fortune? What technology was behind this production? The answer lies in the closed and brutal world of the ludus, a true fighter factory where every aspect of life, from diet to medicine, was subordinated to one goal: creating the perfect machine for spectacular survival. The paradox of this factory begins on the plate. Why were elite fighters, whose bodies were worth a fortune, fed cheap vegetarian porridge made of barley and beans? The ludus was a hybrid of a maximum security prison and an Olympic training facility. Iron discipline, grueling training with heavy wooden weapons, and constant supervision. But a fighter's diet was closer to that of a peasant than a predator. The answer comes from the bones at the Gladiator cemetery in Ephesus. Analysis showed extremely high levels of strontium, indicating a diet rich in carbohydrates and calcium. It was designed to create what is known as the gladiator's bulk, a layer of subcutaneous fat. This fat acted like the bark of a tree. It protected internal organs and nerve endings from shallow cuts that were spectacular for the crowd but not life-threatening. The diet was part of the economic model of survival, creating more blood with less risk to the asset. It was armor they wore under their skin. But food was just one tool for protecting investments. Another, no less important, was medicine. What made slave owners hire the best doctors of their time for them, such as the famous Galen, who began his career in the ludus of Pergamum? The answer? Pragmatism. The job of professional surgeons was to get a fighter back in action as quickly as possible. But in a world without antibiotics, any laceration could lead to sepsis and death. Therefore, all combat tactics and training were aimed at avoiding deep, penetrating wounds. Galen himself called gladiator wounds windows into the body, using them to study anatomy, which was impossible on ordinary citizens. They were treated not out of compassion. Death from an accidental infection was an unfortunate but acceptable business risk. A guaranteed death in the arena was a direct financial loss. But before these expensive assets entered the arena, the audience needed to be properly warmed up, and for that, they used those whose lives were worth absolutely nothing. What is it like to be both the most desired man in Rome and a slave with no rights? A novice's day in the ludus, early rise, training to exhaustion, a special diet, medical checkups. Inside the school, you are a slave who can be brutally punished for the slightest insubordination. But outside, you are a rock star. Graffiti from Pompeii is covered with the names of gladiators and their victory counts. Noble matrons bought the sweat and dirt scraped from their bodies in small vials as a potent aphrodisiac. This unbearable duality of their position, slave yet idle, prisoner yet elite, was the fuel that powered the drama in the arena. And so, the day of the games arrived. But the show for the public began long before the champions entered the arena. So, the ludus was a conveyor belt for creating the ideal fighter, physically resilient, psychologically charged, and engineered for survival in a spectacular show. But how do you organize a day of games to satisfy both the thirst for blood and the demand for the high art of combat? The Romans found a brilliant and cruel solution. The day's program in the arena was clearly divided, and it began with real, undisguised blood to make the duels of the star gladiators seem even more valuable and noble in contrast. We are heading to the morning arena. The ludus was a hybrid of a maximum security prison and an elite Olympic training center. Iron discipline, constant supervision, grueling training with heavy wooden weapons. But why were these athletes, whose lives were worth a fortune, fed like poor peasants? Their diet of barley and beans was contemptuously called horderii, barley eaters, by their contemporaries. The answer comes from forensic analysis of bones from the Gladiator cemetery in Ephesus. The diet was rich in carbohydrates and calcium. Its purpose was to deliberately create the so-called gladiator's bulk, a layer of subcutaneous fat. This fat worked like the bark of a tree. It could be scratched, a shallow cut could be inflicted, and it would look dramatic. But the living core, the gladiator's muscles and organs, would remain unharmed. The diet was part of the economic model. It made the fighter more spectacular, more blood with less risk to the asset's life. It was armor they wore under their skin. But food was just one of the tools for protecting investments. Another, no less important, was medicine. This brings us back to the first paradox. Why were resources spent on cannon fodder by hiring the best doctors of the time, such as the famous Galen, who began his career in the ludus of Pergamum? Because their task was not just to heal, but to restore the fighter as quickly as possible and return him to the ranks. Treatment was the absolute priority to protect the Lanista's multi-million sestertii investments. But here is what the sources hide. In a world without antibiotics, any laceration could lead to sepsis and death. That is why combat tactics and training were aimed at avoiding deep, penetrating wounds. Galen himself called gladiator wounds windows into the body, using them to study anatomy. They were treated not out of compassion, but out of cold pragmatism. Death from infection was an unfortunate business risk. A guaranteed death in the arena was a direct financial loss. But before these expensive assets entered the arena, the audience needed to be properly warmed up. And for that, they used those whose lives were worth absolutely nothing. What is it like to be both the most desired man in Rome and a slave with no rights? The day of a novice, Tiro, in the ludus, was governed by routine: early rise, grueling training, a special diet, medical checkups. Inside the school, there was a strict hierarchy, from novices to star veterans. But outside the walls of the ludus, everything was different. Inside, you are a slave who can be brutally punished for disobedience. Outside, you are a rock star. Graffiti from Pompeii is filled with the names of gladiators and their victory counts. The sweat and dirt scraped from their bodies were sold in small vials as a potent aphrodisiac for noble matrons. This unbearable duality of their position, slave and idol, prisoner and elite, was the fuel that powered the drama in the arena, making it real for the spectators. And so, the day of the games arrived. But the show for the public began long before the champions entered the arena. So the ludus was a conveyor belt for creating the ideal fighter, physically resilient, psychologically charged, and engineered for survival in a spectacular show. But how do you organize a day of games to satisfy both the thirst for blood and the demand for the high art of combat? The Romans found a brilliant and cruel solution. The day's program in the arena was clearly divided, and it began with real, undisguised blood to make the duels of the star gladiators seem even more valuable and noble in contrast. We are heading to the morning arena. So where did the persistent myth of gladiatorial combat as a relentless bloodbath come from, if 90% of professional bouts were, in essence, a sport? The source of this misconception is not in the main events. It's in the day's schedule. In the morning, it wasn't gladiators who entered the arena. The Venatines began, mass hunts of exotic animals. The numbers destroy any illusion of this spectacle being harmless. During the 100 days of games for the opening of the Colosseum, about 9,000 wild animals were killed. That's one animal every 15 minutes nonstop. Entire species, like the Atlas bear and the North African elephant, were exterminated for entertainment. This was the real blood. The morning slaughter served as a warm-up, but the animal hunt was only the first part of the morning's nightmare. What happened in the arena during the hottest part of the afternoon, when the nobility left for lunch, leaving only the plebs in the stands? The midday executions, the Noxii, began. Those sentenced to death were brought into the arena, criminals, deserters, enemies of the state. The reality of these executions was brutal. They were crucified, burned alive, or thrown to the wild beasts left over from the morning hunt. These were not gladiators, they were expendable material, people whose status was lower than that of a slave. The Roman writer Seneca described this spectacle with disgust. It is pure murder. They have nothing to protect their bodies. This is where the myth was born. Posterity confused two different events, the morning slaughter and the afternoon show. And only when the arena was cleared of blood did the true professionals step onto the sand. How did the Romans themselves, the creators of law and a great culture, view this bloody warm-up? The intellectual elite, like the philosopher Seneca, described the morning spectacles with disgust. For them, it was a low-brow slaughter. They arrived at the arena later. However, for the state, the Venatines were a demonstration of imperial might. The ability to bring thousands of dangerous creatures from all corners of the world to Rome and destroy them proved Rome's limitless power over the world. The morning program served a dual function. It satisfied the bloodlust of the common people and demonstrated imperial power. This made the subsequent, almost bloodless gladiator fights an act of order and high art against the backdrop of the morning's chaos. So, we have solved the riddle of Roman cruelty. A real slaughter, massive and merciless, did indeed take place. but its victims were animals and criminals, not professional gladiators. When the sand of the arena was cleaned and the time for the main event arrived, bloody chaos was replaced by strict order. A gladiatorial duel was not a chaotic brawl, but a sporting contest with its own referees, an unwritten code of honor, and a complex system of rules. And the main purpose of these rules was to create drama, not to stage a massacre. How can there be rules in a duel where life is at stake? The very idea seems absurd. After all, the main principle is kill or be killed. But in the arena, there was always a key figure that Hollywood stubbornly ignores: the referee, or summa ludus, and his assistant. Frescoes and mosaics show that these men in togas did not just observe. They actively intervened in the fight, armed with a long staff, the rudis, which they used to physically separate the fighters. And here is what these images hide. A losing gladiator did not surrender to the crowd or the editor. He raised his index finger, the official gesture of surrender to the referee, who would immediately stop the bout. It was the referee, not the crowd, who in 90% of cases decided the outcome of the fight, protecting the valuable assets. But referees alone were not enough. The very structure of the fight was cleverly designed to avoid a quick and unspectacular death. Why were gladiators armed so strangely, and at first glance, ineffectively? Why pit a fighter with a net and trident, a retiarius, against a heavily armed warrior with a sword and a huge shield, a secutor? It was a balanced system. There were classic pairings, a light and agile fighter against a slow but well-protected one. Each pair was matched on the principle of scales. The speed of the retiarius balanced the defense of the secutor, preventing the scales from tipping quickly to one side. This balance had a hidden purpose. It intentionally prolonged the duel, turning it from a quick skirmish into a tactical chess match. This gave the fighters a chance to demonstrate their skill, and the crowd a chance to enjoy a long and tense drama. The armament of gladiators was designed not for maximum lethality, but for maximum spectacle. But what happened when, despite all the tricks, one of the fighters finally fell to the sand? This is where Hollywood gets it most wrong. The thumbs down gesture is a myth, popularized in the 19th century. The real signal was likely different, but the key point is this: the decision was made by the editor, following the will of the crowd. And the will of the crowd turns out to be surprising. Contrary to stereotypes, spectators most often demanded mercy, missio, for a fighter who had fought bravely but lost. To kill a coward was normal, but to grant life to a worthy opponent was considered a manifestation of virtus, or valor, and generosity on the part of the editor. Inscriptions from Pompeii show that fans kept meticulous records not only of victories, but also of pardons a fighter received. It was a sign of his skill and the public's respect. Mercy was the norm. Death was the rare and expensive exception. So, we have established that a gladiatorial duel was a strictly regulated sport with its own referees, balanced weaponry, and a code where mercy was the rule. But if the fights were not fatal, why did the Romans go to them at all? What did the crowd really want, if not blood? The answer lies in the psychology of the spectators and what gladiators meant to them. They were not just fighters. They were superstars whose duels were not a slaughter, but a true drama of valor, skill, and the will to live. Have you ever rooted for an athlete so hard that their defeat felt like a personal tragedy? The Romans felt the same, but 100 times over. If 90% of fights did not end in death, what exactly kept thousands of eyes glued to the stands? The answer is simple. The Romans came not for an execution, but for a theater of valor. The gladiators, whom inscriptions in Pompeii call suspirium puellarum, the sigh of young girls, were stars. Bets were placed on them, and they had fan clubs. But the sporting interest was only the surface. The crowd came to watch how a man faces mortal danger, to witness a demonstration of virtus, a key concept in Roman culture. A clumsy and quick victory was valued less than a technical and courageous defeat. The loser, raising his index finger, was not begging for mercy. He was officially acknowledging defeat and demonstrating his readiness to die with honor. This is what commanded respect. And it was this psychology that turned the decision of mercy into a crucial political act for the organizer of the games. Two of your assets, worth a fortune, are in the arena. What is more profitable, the death of one for a spectacular finale, or the survival of both for future profits? From a business perspective, the answer is obvious. The survival of both fighters allowed for a rematch, the creation of a long-running rivalry, and the sale of souvenirs featuring both stars. But the editor was not just a businessman. He was a politician, and his main currency was not sestertii, but votes in the next election. To go against the will of a crowd demanding mercy for a brave loser was tantamount to political suicide. Generosity was valued more than blood. The editor's decision worked like an apothecary's scales. On one side lay gold, on the other, his reputation. His gesture was not just a decision. It was the culmination of the entire show. And this system of survival was built into the fighter's career itself. How could a slave, legally a thing, have a career ladder? Under Roman law, gladiators were considered infames, dishonored. But in practice, they were superstars with huge fees. Inside the ludus, there was a clear system of ranks, from a novice, Tiro, to the school's champion, Primus Paulus. Each victory increased a fighter's status and value. But a shocking fact shatters this picture. A significant percentage of fighters were octorati, free Roman citizens who voluntarily signed a contract. Their motive? Huge sums of money. The prize for a single victory could be several times a legionary's annual salary. This proves that being a gladiator was not just slavery but a profession. A deadly dangerous profession, but a profession nonetheless with a contract, the octoramentum, under which a person swore to endure fire, chains, whipping, and death by the sword. And the pinnacle of this career was not death in the arena, but something entirely different. So, now we see, the main event of the day was not a primitive slaughter, but a complex theater of valor. Its foundation was the psychology of the crowd, which valued virtues over blood. This show was managed by the cold calculation of the editores, for whom the fighters were expensive political assets. This system turned gladiatorial combat into a brutal but real profession with its own career ladder. But every career must have an ultimate goal. What awaited those who passed through all the circles of this hell? They fought not just for their lives, but for a specific prize that would forever change their status in the world. What awaits a person whose profession is the daily risk of death? Oblivion? Poverty? No. After a successful career, typically 3 to 5 years and 10 to 15 fights, a gladiator could receive the highest honor. The symbol of his new life was a simple wooden sword, the ludus. The editor would present it in the arena to thunderous applause, and yesterday's slave would become a free and wealthy man before the eyes of thousands. But this was not just an honorable discharge. It was the jackpot. A successful veteran would leave with a fortune that could provide for his family for generations. Receiving the ludus was not a happy accident, but the programmed goal of the entire system. This hope for freedom and wealth was the main fuel that compelled fighters to perform miracles of valor in the arena. But what could a free man, who only knew how to kill, do in Roman society? And this created the greatest paradox of their new life. By law, Even a freed gladiator remained infames, dishonored, on par with actors. He was forbidden from holding public office. It seems his freedom was incomplete, but the reality was different. Analysis of bones from gladiator cemeteries shows signs of healed, severe wounds, and complex surgeries. These men survived, and they prospered. Some opened their own gladiatorial schools, transforming from commodities into businessmen. Others became highly paid trainers for aristocrats or elite bodyguards. The system was not created for killing. It was created to produce legends. Survival, fame, and wealth after the arena were not the exception, but the final product of this ruthless conveyor belt. Their tombstones proudly list their victories and mention their wives and children. This perfectly tuned machine seemed eternal, but it was killed by the same force that gave it life: economics. Why did this incredibly popular system collapse? The simplest answer is the spread of Christianity, which condemned pagan spectacles. This version seems logical, but the numbers tell a different story. The main factor was the economic collapse of the late Roman Empire. The cost of the games was astronomical. At the opening of the Colosseum alone, 9,000 wild animals were killed. This was a logistical and financial nightmare. In conditions of hyperinflation and the breakdown of trade routes, the games became an unaffordable luxury, even for emperors. The irony of history is that the games were killed by the same force that created them: economics. They were the product of a wealthy empire and died along with it. The disappearance of entire species of animals in North Africa proves the incredible scale of this business. And the main lesson the Colosseum left us turned out not to be about cruelty at all. So, we have seen that a gladiator's career had a clear goal: freedom and wealth, symbolized by the wooden sword, the ludus. Their paradoxical status, after being freed, only confirms that the entire system was aimed at creating living legends. And the fall of this machine was caused not by changing morals, but by the economic collapse of the empire itself. We have dismantled the 3 key myths about the arena. In the next 60 seconds, we will put the whole mosaic together so you can change your view of gladiators forever. So, let's assemble all the pieces of this machine. At its core lies not bloodlust, but cold economics. The model of renting, rather than buying, fighters for a single bout made their death a direct financial loss for all parties involved. This was the first and foremost safety mechanism of the system. The second element was the fighter factory, the ludus. Here, slaves and volunteers were turned not into cannon fodder, but into ultra-expensive assets. A special diet, advanced medicine, daily training, all of this was an investment that had to be protected. And to satisfy the crowd's thirst for real blood, there was the morning program: mass animal hunts and public executions of criminals. This ingeniously separated the streams, real slaughter for some and the high art of combat for others. This is why more than 90% of duels ended without a death. This resolved the paradox of a spectacle without fatalities posed at the very beginning. Let's move to the main event. The unwritten code of the arena and the presence of referees, the summa rudis, transformed a potential slaughter into a sport with complex rules. The referee was often a former gladiator whose word was law, capable of stopping the fight at any moment. This ensured that the duel would be spectacular and technical, not short and bloody. Layered on top of this was the psychology of the spectators. The crowd, raised on the cult of virtus, wanted to see not death, but drama, skill, and perseverance. Mercy for a brave loser was the norm, not the exception. The entire system was geared toward creating and repeatedly exploiting superstars, just like in modern sports or Hollywood. This was the first global show business in human history. And here is the main paradox of the gladiator, which we have unraveled. While at the bottom of the social ladder, legally dishonored, he possessed colossal economic value. His life and skill were a commodity. And like any expensive commodity, he was cared for, repaired, and put up for sale again and again. The myth of the bloody slaughter that we know from movies is just a brilliant but false marketing package. The real product was hope, the drama of survival, and the demonstration of valor. The arena was not a temple of death, but a market where the most expensive currency was a human life, preserved for the amusement of the public. The myth of blood was just the smoke that concealed the cold and precise mechanism of an economic fire. Now, when you look at modern mixed martial arts, don't you see a shadow of that very same machine? And now that all the pieces of the machine are in place, the main question is for you. Having learned all this, who is the gladiator to you now? A tragic victim of a ruthless system where he had no choice, or a pragmatic athlete who consciously chose the riskiest, but also the fastest, path to fame and freedom in a cruel world? Write just one word in the comments, your final verdict. Victim or athlete? Let's see which one is more common among us.